Great. So let's, I'd like to actually just take a few minutes, or not a few minutes, a few seconds, and just if you could look at me.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Yes.
Tell me, please, are both my eyes the same size?
Yes, they are. Excellent. Can we start off can you tell me your name and where and when you were born?
My name is Eli Gotz, and I was born in Kaunas, Lithuania, on the 8th of March, I'm sorry. I was born on the 8th of March, 1928.
Fabulous. Can we do it again, starting at the beginning?
My name is Eli Gotz, and I was born in Kaunas, Lithuania, on the 8th of March, 1928.
Fabulous. Can you talk a little bit about what Kaunas, your early memories of Kaunas?
The early memories of Kaunas are pleasant. It was a nice medieval town, fairly modern down in the center, with a large Jewish population. And I lived a very happy life there. We lived on the main drag, on the main street, Laisvės alėja, Freedom Alley, in an apartment, a rented apartment, on the second floor, and there were a lot of kids in the yard. So I used to play with kids of all nationalities. We had some German, we had some Russian, some Polish, and some Lithuanians.
Was there a sense when you were with your friends that you were Jewish? Was that an issue in your early years?
The issue was never in the yard, but when I went to school, I sometimes had to pass boys, Christian boys, who would sometimes be threatening to me. So I avoided certain corners of the path where I knew they used to congregate. I was conscious of it, and I sometimes had to be careful. But generally, I went to a Yiddish school, so I had no problems in school, and many of my friends were Jewish.
And what was the family business? Was there a family business?
There was no family business. My father worked in a bank as a bookkeeper. He wanted to be an engineer, but the First World War interrupted his studies, so he had to be a bookkeeper in a Jewish bank. My mother was a nurse. She was a surgical nurse, and she worked. And when I was born, she had to give up nursing, so she worked at home. And she learned cutting designing. She used to make ladies' dresses to help bring in some money.
And were you, was it a struggle financially, or were you comfortable?
My parents were struggling, but I was not aware of it until much later.
What did you grow up in an observant family, a reformed family? How did religion fit into your life?
I grew up my parents were not religious at all, and yet my grandparents were very religious. So I was very aware of the religious attitude, but I did not have it.
By the way, you answer perfectly, in the perfect way. So life was happy. You had friends of different nationalities and different religions, but you were aware that anti-Semitism existed.
I was completely aware that anti-Semitism existed in Lithuania, and I knew my Jewishness was very strong. I went to a Yiddish school. I knew Jewish history, Jewish geography, but religion I was not trained in.
And what kind of a young man were you? Were you a studious young man, a serious young man, an adventurous young? What were you like?
I was a talkative, science-focused guy. I liked mathematics, I liked science, I liked the history of science. I admired people like Edison, who were inventors of new ideas, of new things. And I enjoyed school. I was a very good student.
Lovely. What age did you feel things start to change for you in terms of the environment in Kaunas?
The change in my environment came about in 1 second when I looked out the window and I saw German tanks in the street. Until then, life was normal. I was aware of Germany and Hitler because we had a lot of German refugees living amongst us. That is how I learned a lot of German. I spoke several languages, Russian, Yiddish, Lithuanian, German, and I knew all the trouble of Jews. My father used to say, I wish we were behind the Ural Mountains. He only thought of going towards Russia to run away from the war that was coming. But my life changed totally in one moment when the German army marched in on the 22nd of June, 1941.
And did this come as a total surprise, or were there murmurs and rumblings that something was happening?
It was expected. It was expected, and I later blamed my father for not trying to get out of Lithuania. He used to say, a war is coming, but he did nothing about it.
Why do you think your parents didn't do anything about it? Were they very rooted? Did they have other family that they were concerned about? Why the inaction?
The inaction of not trying to get out of what would become a war zone was simply financial. It was difficult. I asked my father later, why didn't you get out? Why didn't you take us to Africa? You had a brother in Rhodesia. Why didn't you go out? He said, Rhodesia, a strange country, learning a new language. It would have been much easier to have gone to Russia somewhere and hide in the Siberia somewhere. But we had no money, and going to the Soviet Union was not practical, and nor was it very desirable, apparently, to him. So we stayed where we stayed put. We stayed put.
Did you understand that the anxiety and fear of your parents, and did that translate to you in those
Yes.
early days?
Yes, we talked about that anxiety of what will happen. Germany had invaded France. Germany was on the war path. It was clear that the agreement that Germany made with the Soviet Union of non-aggression would not last. We knew it, and we talked about it at home.
How, when the Germans invaded, what were the tangible changes to your day-to-day life?
When the German army marched in, there were local people who put on a white armband and went out hunting for Jews. They grabbed Jews in the street, they robbed them, and then they killed them. Then they started to lock up Jews that they grabbed on the 7th fort. Over 5,000 people, Jews, Jewish men, were murdered. The women they let out later. But it was an attack on the Jews, started from day one, before the Nazis took over Lithuania.
How old were you?
I was 13 when the war started. I finished grade 6 and I got a uniform to go to high school. I was very proud of my uniform, but I never got to use it. I never went to high school.
What happens to someone, to you, when you go from living a life of relative safety and security to a life of fear? I think it's very hard for those of us in Toronto and in Canada to understand what that means to go from, to make that shift, that transition. How do you do that? What happens?
It must be very difficult for people here in Canada to understand the huge transition from being a child with dreams. For example, when I was 13, I dreamt I want to be an engineer and I want to be a pilot. I used to build model airplanes all the time and read books and go to school, and suddenly be locked up in the house, don't go out, don't show yourself. You have to go out in the street, you have to walk in the gutter, not on the sidewalk. Later came a Yellow Star of David to wear clothes on the clothes. It is difficult to explain how radical a change that was. You suddenly become a hunted person.
Yeah.
Scary, terrifying.
It is terrifying. It's terrifying. I'm sorry,
Can I tell you one event?
Yeah.
For example, one event. I had an uncle who had a high position and under the government there, and he was very afraid that the Nazis or the local Lithuanians might hunt for him. So he went from the house, he came to visit our house. And I was ill in bed. So he was sitting next to my bed when a Lithuanian white armbander came in with a rifle. My father came out to greet him in the front room. And the man said, "Who is here? Who is here?" And my father said, "My son is ill." He said, "You come with us." And my father said, "I can't go with you. My son is ill." And he pointed through the door to my bed where I was lying there. And my uncle was sitting frozen still at the foot of my bed. And the soldier said, "Okay." He looked at my father, he looked at me, and he walked out. And I think if my uncle he would have gone crazy that moment. He remained sitting there, frozen. A scary moment.
How long after the German army, the occupation, was it before the ghetto was created?
It took a couple of months for the Germans to take over. The first 6 weeks, where the Lithuanian right-wingers formed a provisional government, and that government passed a law. The first law was, the Jews are not citizens of Lithuania. We had lived there for 800 years. And all the laws were that they want to separate us from society and so on. But then the Germans took down that government. After 6 weeks, they closed them up. In those 6 weeks, over 5,000 Jews in my city were murdered by Lithuanian partisans, Lithuanian military. And then the Nazis took over and announced the Jews are the worst people in the world. We are going to put them separate from society in a ghetto. And they took an old part of town in Kaunas, in Kovno. I say Kovno, Russian way, Kaunas, Lithuanian way of calling the city. And they took an old part of town, which was in fact an old Jewish quarter, a poor quarter. And that is where the ghetto was established, surrounded by barbed wire, soldiers, and 20,000 Jews were made to move into the ghetto.
And 20,000 Jews in a space that could comfortably house how many?
Oh, much less. We were supposed to be allowed 3 square meters per person or something. We had very little space. My family and I, we got one small room in a house. It was very crowded. And we were not allowed to rent trucks to move our goods into the ghetto. We only horses, horse-drawn carriages, or by hand. So we carried all our possessions on horse carts into the ghetto. It took about 2 months to move into the ghetto for all the people.
What was the, do you remember what the atmosphere was like in the ghetto? How people were feeling at that moment?
The scary part of moving into the ghetto was that there were Lithuanians with guns who were hanging around the corners and stopping the wagons and examining what you were taking and stealing what they wanted. We also lost some of our goods by moving into the ghetto and having taken some suitcases off the horse platform that we walked with. It was a nervous time. We didn't know what would happen to us. But later it settled down in the ghetto. Life settled down.
And what did you do in the ghetto? It became an important time for you in a way.
When we moved into the ghetto, there was no school for me, of course. There was nothing. In fact, it was summer, and then by the end of August, we were in the ghetto. And I ran around. I had nothing much to do until the activity of the Nazis began. First, they came into our house, and every place, every room, every door, and they said, hand over all your valuables, gold, silver, money, anything, jewelry. We put it on the table. 2 soldiers came into our room and demanded. And my mother took out her jewelry, and my father, with shaking hands, emptied his pocket. And we brought a pair of silver candlesticks, I remember we had, and a couple of other valuable things that were made of silver or something. We didn't have much. We were not very wealthy people at all. And then they said, have you got a camera? My father had a camera. Put it down. Have you got furs? My mother had a fur. Bring it here. They packed it all up. They took it away. They made a list of they wrote down what they took from us, and they gave us a receipt. They gave us a copy. They asked us for our surname and wrote it on top and gave us a copy. It was very orderly. Germany was an orderly nation. They recorded everything.
Yes, Germany is an orderly nation. It was also a time where you read a lot, didn't you? Books became very important to you during that period. It feels like.
Books was the other big problem. My father loved books. He had a big library. Even though he didn't have much money, every Friday he used to go to a bookstore, buy a book, go to the library, borrow books for himself and my mother to read, and buy a book that he wanted to have. And now, when we moved into the ghetto, my father insisted that all books have to come with. He packed them up in cartons, and we carried the heavy cartons to the ghetto. But when we moved into that one room, there was no place to store it. So all the cartons were not unpacked, but left at one wall in the bedroom that we had where we were living, unopened. And then after they robbed us of all our wealth in the ghetto, they took out a lot of money and gold and valuables, came another order. You have to hand over your books. Now that was a big tragedy for my father. He went into his books, he picked out a few less valuable books. We took a wheelbarrow, and he and I went with the wheelbarrow to deliver the books to the center. The collection center was the local synagogue. They took out all the benches, and they told everybody, throw the books on the floor. So we did. We walked in there, and we came in, and we saw this mountain of books lying there. And my father said to me, you notice, with the books they trust us. Nobody is watching, no guards, no soldiers. And then he bent down and he picked up a beautiful volume, red book, and there were more on the floor. He said, Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, Pushkin, the 5 volumes, the gold edition. I always wanted to buy it, he said, but I couldn't afford it. And now it's on the floor. You know what Eli said to me? Leave our books here, they are not so valuable. Take the Pushkin, I will take it home. Then he walked around and he picked other books. He picked up a beautiful collection, 2 volumes by Gretz, Geschichte der Juden, History of the Jews in German, and other books. Eventually I said, Dad, I can't take anymore, it's full. He said, okay, cover it with a newspaper, we are going home. And we went home with a wheelbarrow. And we did it 7 times. We went empty and we came back full. So, a huge amount of books. My mother was furious with him. What are you doing? They'll come and kill us here. You are stealing books. My father reassured her that he's not keeping them in the house. He told me to climb up in the shed outside and put it on the ceiling of the shed on top. And that's what I did. All our books and the new books all went up there. I grew up with several languages, so I could read Russian, German, Yiddish literature I knew very well. And I had the classic library of Europe upstairs there. I spent my time reading. I learned Russian really well, reading Tolstoy in the original, Anna Karenina, War and Peace. I read the German literature, the classics. I learned Pushkin by heart. I learned the German poets by heart. That was my education.
Amazing. Amazing. Before we get to the great action?
Aktion.
Can you, I want to go back to the moment when you were hiding with the syringes.
We were hiding when I was 16. I was 13 when I came into the ghetto.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was 13 when I came into the ghetto. 3 years later, my family was still in the ghetto. Only about 8,000 people were left out of 20,000. And now the Russian army was coming very close. They were fighting. The front was next to our city. We could hear the guns. And we were very afraid. What will they do with us, the remainder of the Jews in the ghetto? And the Nazis announced, we are liquidating the ghetto. Liquidation to us meant one thing, they are going to kill us like they killed the others. But they said, we are taking you guys somewhere else to work. And we did not believe them. We were certain they were going to kill us. So our family decided, we are not going where they want to take us. We are going to hide. And if they find us, we will commit suicide. We went down into the basement of our house, a cellar actually, and in the foundation of cement foundation with a wooden top. The house was a 2-story house. In the foundations there were rooms with doors. So we opened the door and we saw a mass of junk and old furniture. So we cleaned it out, one room, we put everything in a separate room across from the passage. We brought in water and food. And my whole family, which was my 3 uncles, my aunt, my parents and I, we went into that room. But before going in, we dragged a heavy cupboard to the door, to cover the door. And we crawled through the cupboard into the room. And that was when we decided, if they find us, we will commit suicide. So my mother got the job to prepare. And everybody asked her, "Are you ready, Sonia?" "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." She laid out a tray with a white cloth, very clean, and on it she had syringes lying, a number of syringes lined up. They were filled with a brown drug. And she explained that this drug, we give it to old people when their heart is beating too slow to accelerate, to speed up the heart. But I'm going to give everybody a big injection. It's going to make the heart race and stop, create a heart attack. So everybody asked her, "Are you sure it'll work?" "I'm sure it'll work. I confirmed with the surgeon." We sat in front of those syringes for 3 long days. And I was looking, at the beginning, I saw my mother put cotton wool on each syringe and a bottle of alcohol. And I thought about it, and I said, "Mother, this is a last injection. Doesn't have to be a clean one, you know." And we all laughed, except my mother. She said, "I've been doing it like that all my life." But she took away the cotton wool. And I was wondering at 16 if my mother would be willing to really inject me when the time came. But I decided I'm going first. I'm an only child, I always come first. I decided I don't want to watch the family die. It'll probably be a lot of pain and crying. I'm going first. So we sat for 3 days and nights and nothing happened. It was very quiet. And the 4th morning we heard 2 soldiers coming down the stairs with the rifles. They were hitting the wooden stairs. And they walked past our cupboard, and they went to the end of the passage, and they looked in other rooms, and they came back. And I was sitting in front of my mother with my arm out, and she had a syringe in her hand. If they start moving the cupboard, she will inject me. They didn't come in. They didn't move the cupboard. One of them walked into the room opposite and saw all the junk furniture we put there. And he came out and told the other one, "There's just furniture." And they walked out. So my mother put away the syringe. And we were sitting there. Another, I don't know, 3-4 days, I was lying on the floor on a blanket. I couldn't sit on the hard chair. And then one of my uncles said, "You know, I think the Russians must be here already. They were just outside the city. Let's go out and have a look. We'll stay here forever otherwise." So we went outside, and we saw that the Nazis were still there. And our people were marching to a train. So we took our little luggage that we always had ready, and we went to a train. Perhaps they didn't lie to us. Perhaps they are taking us somewhere to work, was our reasoning. Many people remained hidden in their basements, in their holes, and they burned down the whole ghetto as soon as the train left. So some 3,000 people died there, were shot if they came out. We got out just in time. Lucky, lucky.
Pardon?
No battery.
Battery. Well, is it okay if we take one moment?
Sure.
So I mean, it's creeping up on me.
Okay.
Don't look at me.
Don't look at me. How are
Don't
you?
look at you. You know what? I do intermittent fasting, so like it's
Intermittent.
okay. So
I
all you,
heard that's the thing.
it is. I've lost like 30 pounds just by not
See,
eating
the
lunch.
Jews already are on this intermittent fasting thing. We have lots of
And it started with Ellie's daughter Julia, who told my husband, I thought, I don't believe this. Then my husband lost 30 pounds in
Yeah, it's
such
crazy.
a short period, like and he's been trying for like a lot of years. A lot of years.
What did you
David,
do
I want to
exactly?
carry
You
on.
like don't eat from.
So I'll tell you after.
Oh,
you're finished.
intermittent
I'll tell you.
fasting?
Yeah.
Intermittent fasting.
16 hours?
Well, he doesn't know. I'll tell you his
All
whole
right,
story
all right,
afterwards.
you're-
I don't want to distract you
okay.
from your thing.
Let's go. We are carrying on.
We're doing good.
Sure, we are
Okay.
carrying on.
Here we go.
Is it family?
I want to ask you just about. I want to go back. I know we're about to get to Dachau, but I just want to go back and ask you about 2 things, if you don't. 3
Sure.
things, if you don't mind, and we can be brief.
Anything you like.
Can you just briefly describe what the Great Action was?
On the 28th of October, they announced the day before, no one goes to work. 28th of October 1941. They said nobody goes to work. Everyone has to come out in a big open field in the ghetto, in the center of the ghetto. Leave the doors open. We can come in, and if we find you, we will shoot you on the spot. 20,000 people were out in the field. We didn't know why. And in front of us stood a man in a uniform, and he demanded that we walk past him in families. And he gave directions. He sorted us. One family, go back to the ghetto. Another family, outside the fence, stand there. And there were guards there guarding them. And it took a whole day, and they separated our 20,000 people into two halves. Half our population was outside the fence. Half was back in the ghetto. My family, back in the ghetto. Most of our family. Some people were there. We didn't know what would happen to us. But next morning, those 10,000 standing outside were marched away up the hill, away from the ghetto, towards the 9th Fort. The 9th Fort was a military compound where soldiers practiced shooting and marching, a very large area. And there, 10,000 men, women, and children were murdered in one day on the 29th of October, 1941, with machine guns. The shooters were Lithuanian soldiers. The supervisors and the managers were German. And the guy who sorted us, the guy who organized the whole operation, he lived in Canada for 32 years after the war. Helmut Raucher. There is a book about him here. Helmut Raucher came to Canada in 1950, and he was living in Huntsville. He bought a motel. He had a lot of money, our money, because when they took the money and the valuables from us, he got some too. He bought a motel, then he retired, and he was our neighbor up north in Toronto here. Finally, they found him. The judge said, this man is accused of 11,492 murders. That was the German report from Germany about him. We can't try him because we don't have the information. Send him to Germany. He was sent to Germany, but he never came to court. He died before the court case was ready. That was a great action in Kaunas when we lost family and friends, and 3/4 of my classroom mates were lost there. And we found out later what happened to them.
Yeah, thank you. Can you tell me a little bit about we're just waiting for
It's your telephone.
the telephone. How are we? We're okay with the. I mean, we can because it's yeah. I mean, it's a.
I barely hear it because
Okay.
the mic is so close to him.
Perfect. Excellent. Can you, Ellie? Can you tell me about Shulamit?
About?
Shulamit? Is it Shulamit?
Dahlia.
Shulamit.
Shulamit. Oh,
Dahlia. Dahlia?
Dahlia, yeah. My little cousin was born 6 months before the war. We called her Shulamit, and she was in the ghetto, a little girl in a room with 12 people. In the morning, they all disappeared because we all had to go from the age of 15 to 65 for slave labor. They took us into the city to work in factories and building an airport and whatever. So only my aunt remained there with her. And my aunt was cooking for 12 people. She didn't have time for the child, and the child was all alone. So she asked me, Ellie, when you come back from the technical school I was attending there in the ghetto, the trade school, play with her. She's all alone. And I started to look after her. And she was a lovely little girl. By this time, she was 1.5 years old. She was speaking fluently Yiddish. And I played with her and I looked after her. And after a while, I felt she was my baby. At 15, I had a baby. I loved her. She was a lovely child. One day, my uncle said, they are going to kill us all. I want my child out of the ghetto. Maybe she'll survive. So he wrote a letter to his friend, a good friend, a Lithuanian, very fine man, and he asked him if he would take his child. We didn't have mail in the ghetto. The letters went secretly. He used to send it from his workplace where he went to work every day. And the letter came back from his wife of that man, and she wrote, I don't know where my husband is. The Russians arrested him before the Germans came. I have no children. I'll take your child. Can I meet you to talk? Uncle wrote back where he works. She came there. He snuck out because he used to go to work under guard with soldiers. 20 men and 2 soldiers used to march them there. So he snuck out and he spoke to her, and he tried to offer her some valuables that he has that she could sell to make money for the child upkeep. She said, don't give me anything. I will not take anything from you, only the child. Arrangements were made. One morning, my mother gave the child a big injection, an anesthetic, knocked her out. They put her in a rucksack, a big rucksack, and my uncle went out to work with a bag on his back. And they used to stop under a bunch of trees to have a rest while they were going to work there, because it was a long way. So he took off the bag and left it behind the tree with his daughter at the inside. And he walked off to work, but he turned back and he saw a man came and grabbed the bag and ran away. And we got a message: the goods have arrived. The child was safe. I fell into a deep depression. I was missing that little girl terribly, and I was thinking, she woke up amongst strangers. She doesn't know who they are. They speak a language she doesn't understand, Lithuanian. But they kept her indoors for a couple of months. She forgot who she was. She forgot Yiddish. She spoke Lithuanian. She called this woman mother. And that is how my cousin Dalia survived the war. Her name Dalia was given to her by the adoptive mother. It means in Lithuanian, fate, a child of fate.
Yeah, it's when you're a parent, of course, all of this stuff is very profound, but the idea of putting your child in a knapsack and leaving it against a tree is sort of, it's...
May I say one more thing?
Of course.
3 months later, after we carried out the child, about 3 or 4 months later, I think it was, I'm not sure of the time, when all the adults were out working in the city, soldiers came into the ghetto and went hunting for children. They came with big trucks and they picked up babies from mother's arms. They tore them away from the mother, and if the mother refused to give up a child, they said, you can go on the truck with the child. They picked up kids up to about the age of 11. They found them in every room. They found them hiding. Sometimes grandmothers or grandfathers were looking after them. They took away our children. Over 3,000 children and some adults went with the children, were taken away and killed the same day. This was a Kinderaktion in the ghetto. After that, I felt at least my little girl survived, my cousin, my dear cousin, Dalia. I have a picture here of her and me when she was a child, after the war.
Is that in your slideshow, that picture?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, the doors of the train open, and you're in Dachau.
The train journey, every survivor knows and tells that the train journey was a horrifying experience. They crammed 200 of us, I think it was, I'm not sure of the numbers, into a freight wagon. It was so crowded we couldn't sit, we were on top of each other. There was no water, there was no food, there was no facilities, a bucket for 150, 200 people. It was terrible. There was no air, you couldn't breathe. There was little windows that are covered with wire. And the train took off towards Germany. And after a while, there were screams and crying in the ghetto, and in the camp, in the I'm sorry. After a while, there were cries and of anguish in the wagon, and people were desperate, and people couldn't breathe, and people died. Overnight, some people died. We came in the morning. They stopped in Poland, the border of Poland and Germany somewhere. And they opened the gates and they told them the doors and they told, "Get out, everybody. Push out the dead bodies before you leave the train." And in 5 minutes, they separated the men from the women. My mother and my aunt remained standing on the platform, and father and I were told to get back on the train. And the train took off and traveled the whole day. I can't remember if it was at night as well. But when we arrived at a big open field in the south of Germany, near Munich, outside Munich, they marched us to a big open field, and we saw a sign, Concentration Camp Dachau, Camp number 1. And when we saw the name Dachau, we knew we were in a very bad place. But when we looked at the camp, it looked such a miserable, sort of primitive place. We realized that it can't be the main camp of Dachau, the famous Dachau that Hitler created in 1933 to lock up his political enemies. A concentration camp is a jail for people who have done nothing wrong except the government doesn't like them. We were in Dachau.
So, when you were in the ghetto, word had traveled back about all of the concentration camps, about Auschwitz. Had that been, what was your level of knowledge about what was happening?
In the ghetto, I personally have not heard the name Auschwitz, but I knew there was a ghetto in Vilnius, in Vilna, and there was a ghetto in Šiauliai, in Lithuania. That we knew. And later we knew that the ghetto of Vilnius was liquidated and that the people were killed. Somehow we knew that. That is why we went into the basement and trying to hide, because we expected to be killed when they said liquidation of the ghetto. So we didn't know much, but we knew one thing. You dare not fight or rise up against the German army, the German management, because they will kill many people if you try something. The announcement was always, for every German soldier killed, 200 Jews will be killed. So no one ever tried to attack the Germans in the ghetto. But our resistance was, young people went out to the forest, secretly to the forest to fight with the partisans. And that is what they were blowing up trains and fighting the German army in the rear guard of the front. So our resistance was entirely focused outside the ghetto. In the ghetto, you don't try anything. One man was once caught with a revolver. He was hanged, and we had to go and watch him being hanged. And we were grateful, so to speak, that they only left it to that one man's fate and not took another 200 people and killed us, because they could have done that.
What year was it when you arrived at Dachau?
1944 in June.
And how did you get a sense of how best to survive in Dachau? What were your early impressions those first few days?
The early impressions of arriving in Dachau were, watch out, you are going to be killed. We were received by a vicious commandant. He kicked us, he hurt us, he was screaming at us, insults. And they took away all our clothes. They took away our suitcase that we brought, whatever. They shaved our heads. And they drove us into those barracks that they had there. And he told us, "You lazy Jews, now you will learn how to work." So it was clear we were in a working camp. So the first impression was not very good. They shaved our heads, we didn't recognize each other. We were given striped uniforms and warm blanket. That's how our life started. Next day, they took us to work.
Did you, I'm not certain what the question is, but it's something we haven't touched on too much, but you grew up with a great fascination in science and engineering. You talked about how one of your early heroes was Edison. And you had great resourcefulness and skills that you had developed along the way.
I didn't develop them. I was in ghetto. I spent 1.5 years learning metal trade, tool making, and I was a very good student. Shall I tell you that story perhaps about the ghetto, the school in the ghetto?
Sure, why don't you?
One of the highlights of my, if I can say that, of my life in the ghetto was that the management of the ghetto asked permission from the Nazis to establish a school for kids like me to learn a trade. And I joined the school, and I learned metalwork. I became a skilled locksmith. I could fix keys and doors. I went around in the ghetto afterwards with a little toolkit, and I used to make extra money by fixing people's locks. I learned how to cut and weld and shape metal. We had a lathe. I learned how to cut it. I learned particularly hand skill, metal hand skills. I became a fine mechanic. And after 1.5 years, I graduated from the school. It was an ORT school, ORT, Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training. Not officially, it was a Jewish organization, but before the war, but the teachers were all from that institute. So they gave us very good training. I even learned blacksmithing. And after I graduated, they offered me a job to teach. And I became a teacher at 15. I was teaching younger kids metalwork. And that saved my life in Dachau, because they asked for mechanics when we arrived at the building site, this giant building site. And I picked up my hand, and they put me in a building which was warm inside with huge machines, pumps, cement pumps. And I had to look after one of the 12 huge pumps that were made to pump cement through pipes to the building site. So I was in a good working place. And I had a nice German Meister who was very good to me. He was polite, he never shouted. He sometimes brought me extra bread, potatoes, because we were starving to death. And I got my father to work in the workshop, so it saved his life. If he had to work outside in pouring cement in the winter, he wouldn't have lasted a month. So the arrival in the camp was not a friendly one, and I got a good job right from the beginning. Hunger was the biggest problem. Hunger. They gave us nothing to eat, and we worked 12-hour shifts in Dachau. We marched out in the morning. We got nothing to eat. We got a cup full of black water, which was called coffee. And when we came back from work, we got a bowl of soup, vegetable soup, no meat, no fat. Sometimes a piece of horse meat was floating there, and a slice of bread. And that's all. So 3 months, any human being can last with that diet and can work full time, because the fat of the body is used up. But after 3 months, the muscles start to disappear and you die of hunger and disease. And we had no washing facilities. So we were full of lice. They were crawling all over our body. Our clothes was full of lice in all the seams. We were scratching all the time, and the lice brought us disease.
Where was your mother? Did you know what happened to your mother during this period?
We did not know anything what happened to my mother, our women. They remained in Stutthof, a concentration camp on the border between Germany and Poland. My mother survived with miracles. She and my aunt were put at the end of the war on a barge which was being dragged out to sea to be drowned. 3,000 women on the barge. They gave them no food. They couldn't organize the food. The women rushed the food, or they said, "You are not getting any." They were drinking seawater. But they were firing on the British aircraft that were flying overhead at the end of the war. So one British bomber turned round and dropped a bomb on the barge. The barge, a piece of it sunk immediately. The barge was burning. Hundreds of women were killed right on the deck. And at that moment, my mother got a piece of steel in her stomach, a 3-inch piece of steel from the bomb. So she was lying on the deck, unconscious, bleeding. And my aunt was sitting next to her. At that moment, a German naval hospital ship pulled up, and they announced, "Women, you have to get off the barge. It's sinking." And German sailors were running up and down the barge, urging the women to get up and go to the net to be picked up. They came to my aunt and they said to her, "You come with us, she's dead," about my mother. And my aunt said, "She's not dead, she's wounded, you have to help her." So 2 sailors grabbed my mother, arms and legs, threw her into a net, picked her up on the ship, put her straight into the operating room, and a German naval surgeon saved her life. My mother lived to 92. She saw great-grandchildren.
How do you even make sense of that story? Like, is it...
You can't make sense of such stories to understand it in human terms of normal life. Everything I'm telling is something that is a bit incredible even to me now. It was accidents of fate, because I'm not a religious person. It was a fate where we had multiple chances to be killed, to die, not to survive. I myself went through a moment when I could have very well been executed. When I was working on the pump, one morning I switched on the pump. It was a huge motor, 150 horsepower, I think it was. And the flame came out of the box, out of the switch box, that totally blinded me, and a big bang, and I heard all the machines running down. No more power. So I thought, okay, I'm blind from the short circuit, but I probably blew out the fuses. I hadn't. Somehow the fuses held, and I blew out the main transformer that were feeding those 12 pumps. When those pumps didn't work, 11,000 people on the work site stopped working. They had nothing to do. And immediately I heard the supervisors running and shouting, "Hang him! Sabotage!" I heard the words. And I thought, that's it, that's my end. But the Meister, my supervisor, said to them, no, it's not his fault, it's a switch. So they left me alone. 2 guys guided me to walk back to the camp, because I was blinded for a couple of days. I couldn't see. I had sand in my eyes, I felt. If he hadn't defended me, they would have hanged me. They sometimes hanged people there for some misdeeds, or else you got beaten to death. So how can you explain that? Just the accident of fate that I'm alive, and that I survived together with my father, together with my mother, 3 of us. That's a total miracle.
Can you tell me about the day of liberation?
They took us out of our camp, a few days before the end of the war. The American army was coming very close, so they stopped this huge construction site that we were building there, and they put us on a train. Actually, most people were marched from our camp to Dachau, about 50 kilometers away. But I remained with my father, who was in the hospital barrack, and I worked in the hospital barrack at the end. So I decided I'm not going on the march, and those people are taken out, because my father was lying there and couldn't walk. But then they packed all the people from the hospital barrack on a train, and the train went to Dachau overnight. Came to Dachau. We arrived in the central camp Dachau, the granddaddy of all concentration camps. We got into barrack number 2, I remember. There were 32 barracks. They were supposed to hold originally 500 people. Later they doubled up and made it 1,000. So there were 4 bunks, one above the other, 4 shelves, packed with people, packed with emaciated people. I weighed 70 pounds when I was liberated. My father weighed 65. And he was very close to death. He couldn't walk, his legs were swollen with hunger, his eyes were not focusing. He was talking very softly, and I thought, I'm losing my father now, very soon. Perhaps they'll kill us all. They promised us to kill us before the war was over. A commandant told us that the last bullet is for you. But I thought my father is not even waiting for that. He couldn't find a spot to lie down. But then they pulled out a dead body from the bottom of one of the shelves. So he grabbed the spot and he crawled in there. And I thought, I'll find him dead in the morning. I carried so many dead bodies, more than I could count. I knew all the signs of death. I fell on the floor and I slept next to him on the floor. But next morning he was still alive, talking to me. Noontime, they brought the soup. He can't get up to stand in line. He gives me his dish. All we had was an aluminum dish and a spoon. So I walked in line and I said, this is for me and this is for him. They gave me a second portion and a piece of bread for each of us. I walked back to my father. He grabbed the soup and people are screaming, the Americans are here, we are free. And I see a jeep standing there. I said, Father, we have made it. We survived. We are alive and we are free. The Americans. Oh, he said, that's good. Have you got the bread? That was my moment of liberation. Have you got the bread? I was afraid he would still die, even though we were free. But half an hour later, he crawled out from the bunk. Everybody who could walk came out to greet the Americans. I was staying next to him. But half an hour later, he crawled out from the bunk and he stood in front of me and he said, so now what? He survived, he lived to 84, he saw grandchildren.
Amazing. Do you want to have a sip of water? And Jody, how are you? Are you?
Do you like some coffee? Anybody make a new pot of coffee?
I'm perfect.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to eat anything else.
Can I have your share?
No,
Anybody?
So should we
I'll
cut
let
for a
you
second?
go for it.
You know, I don't fast Yom Kippur. I say God owes me.
Fair enough.
You've earned that right.
Okay, so you look great. Okay, tell me when we're rolling. Are you rolling, Jackie? Yep. And
So has the we
The
should
coffee
wait till
just
that's
finishing?
done. How much percolating is left, do you think?
It's done.
Shh.
Hold on a second.
I'm switching it off.
Okay.
no, no problem.
You, no, let it, oh, you don't wanna let it finish? Just let it finish. It's almost, it'll be done in 2 minutes. Oh, well.
They would love it if you put on the coffee grinder.
Except we'll have to have it on on for the entire interview so it matches.
Yes, exactly.
This light is really fantastic.
Isn't
So-
it?
Amazing.
What's the brand is that? Is that Westcott?
No, this one is called Falcon Eyes.
I want to know. You must send me the information. Who makes it?
I have your card. I will send it to you.
I gave you my card. You have my
Yes.
email.
Yeah, I have
Thank
it
you.
here.
Okay. Okay. When you want to get settled and yeah, no,
Debbie, quiet.
you go ahead. We'll,
Silence in court.
exactly.
Your coffee timer is done.
Alexa, stop.
That's what we need.
She turned off.
Fabulous.
Alexa, shut up.
Okay,
Okay. Here we go. Let's roll.
rolling.
Go ahead. Sit wherever you would be comfortable.
I was gonna take a couple of pictures and just post
Oh,
them
sure.
on
Yeah, of
in our
course.
Facebook family
Absolutely.
that you guys are doing this.
Okay, here we go. So the war is over. What happened next? You were in a displaced persons camp. What
No.
happened after the war?
When we were liberated, for a couple of days we stayed in Dachau. Then they put us in the barracks of the guards. So we slept in clean beds and we had a shower and we were clean and we were given some light food, controlled. But before that, the first day of liberation, the Americans gave each one of us a 2-pound tin of bully beef, a big tin, because everybody was demanding food. Please give us food. Anyone who ate that meat died the next day and the next 2 days, and many people died. We watched ourselves, my father and I, we mustn't eat it. We knew our stomach couldn't take it. So we cut open one tin, we cut out the other one, we threw out everything, we put water in the tin, and we sat on the side of the passage there in the middle of the camp, and we made a fire with newspapers, and we boiled the water, and we put a little bit of meat in it, and we drank the soup. I don't even know how my father knew that we mustn't eat, but we knew that this would kill us. So we were very careful. And then we got transported, we got taken out from Dachau. One of my uncles was liberated outside, and he managed to get to St. Ottilian, a large monastery which had a military hospital. And we got into that hospital. We stayed 6 months in the hospital. Every day they gave us vitamins. The nuns looked after us. And I started to gain 5 pounds a week. I weighed 70 pounds when I was liberated, and now I started to gain weight, and I had a big stomach, so I started to exercise. There was only a bar available downstairs. I was so weak, I didn't want to go down the stairs because I would have to come up again. 6 months we stayed in hospital. But after 6 months, 3 months later, we found my mother alive and my aunt out in the north of Germany. So we got together. And after 6 months, I was healthy. But I wasn't well. My problem was, I was full of hate. I wanted to kill Germans. I was lying in bed and I couldn't walk down the stairs, but I was planning to kill Germans. And it took a while. I kept thinking that. And one day I realized that it's ridiculous. You can't blame a nation of 40 million people of being murderers. They supported Hitler, but they were not murderers. How do you know whom to kill? How do you know who is going to be guilty here? That guy standing there. He could be a Nazi guard from Dachau. He could have been a professor of history who hated Hitler. I gave up hate. I made myself stop thinking it. I used to push my head sideways to not think in that direction. And then I started to live. When I gave up hate, I started to live. I tell my students now, when I talk to them, students, I say, to hate is like taking poison and hoping that the other would die. Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, said it 2,700 years ago. That is why I come to talk to students. I want to tell them that hate is a waste of time. When I stopped hating, I started living. I remembered I want to be an engineer. And I didn't have high school. So I hit the books. I started to study mathematics and physics and geometry and trigonometry and calculus, and I had difficulties. So I found a professor, a German professor, a teacher, and I asked for help. And she was a nice woman in high school teaching mathematics. And I approached her at home, and she was a bit nervous, and she said she hasn't got time. So I said to her, do you remember you traveled from Landsberg am Lech, where I was in the camp later? You traveled to Munich during the war? She said, yes. Did you see on the train you used to pass a camp down below? Yes, she says, I saw it. There were very thin people there. They didn't look happy. I said, I was in that camp. And now I need some help from you. I will pay. She agreed to help me. She didn't back out. She agreed, and she helped me get enough mathematics that 2 years later I was able to apply to the university in Munich. At the same time, I took a course in electronics. I learned how to repair radios, and now I wanted to be an electronics engineer, not a mechanical engineer. So I applied to the university in Munich. 5 professors were sitting there, a difficult exam, oral exam, mathematics, physics, chemistry, everything. I was accepted at the university. I came home and I told my mother, I'm going to university. She said, no, you're not going. Why? We are leaving. Mom, I said, no country wants us. Nobody wanted us. 150,000 Jews were sitting in Germany and nobody wanted them. Canada was almost closed. They took some orphans, Jewish orphans, and then one guy in the ministry said, for Jews, none is too many. America was closed, Australia, we had relatives in Africa, in South Africa. They couldn't get us in. They wouldn't take Jews or Catholics. What should we do? My mother said, we are going to Norway. Norway? What's Norway? Well, Norway said they'll take 900 Jews because they lost 900 Jews to the Nazis in Auschwitz. We went to Norway. They sent a ship for us. They were wonderful to us. They gave us housing, they gave us bed sheets, they gave us toothbrushes, they gave us pocket money. They were fantastic. I started to learn Norwegian. They had a course. Students came to teach us. The class was very slow. I discovered adults are slow learners. So I went on my own. I took a dictionary and I read the newspaper every day. And I asked Norwegian people walking by to talk to me for 5 minutes. After 3 months, I spoke Norwegian, enough to get a job. I knew 5 languages, so the 6th one wasn't so hard. And I got a job as a radio mechanic in Oslo, in the city. And I lived with a wonderful Norwegian family who were very kind to me. And at night I went to night school to learn Norwegian metric, to get matriculation, so I could go to university. My father wrote to his uncle in South Africa, please send some money. My son wants to be an engineer and he has to work and study at night. Let him study full time. And the uncle replied, I am not allowed to send out money. But he says, now if you come to Africa, I'll make sure your son can go to university. So my parents, because of me, got up. My mother left her 3 brothers, my uncles, and my cousins there in Norway, and we went to Africa. Not South Africa, they wouldn't take us. Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, was a British colony. Now it's called Zimbabwe. Now I had to learn English. I didn't know a word of English. So I got myself into grade 12, and 9 months later I graduated with a good matric, and I went to university in Johannesburg, South Africa, and 4 years later I graduated as an electronic engineer. So I was very happy.
I want to
Take a sip of water.
Oh, it's just so a few things that's wonderful. I want to just revisit two things from what we've talked about. One is when you were in Germany, and you understood that no countries, Canada, the United States, no one was opening up their borders. How did you feel given what had happened during the war to the Jews? How did you make sense of the fact that other countries were simply not welcoming to the Jews?
After the war, we, the survivors, innocently thought that the world would at least be kind to us. Some of us even said, I heard one man say, I'm never going to work again. The American Jews will have to support me after what I went through. And I thought that was ridiculous. Living without work is crazy. I wouldn't want to do that. I was working, I was studying, I was even running a little business, making transformers and whatnot. I didn't think of that, but I thought that the world would be kind to us. Well, they sent us some clothes. The clothes was without buttons. It was amazing. They sent us used clothes that we couldn't wear. There were all kinds of disappointments in the world in the way we were treated. But the United Nations gave us a place to live, a camp, and food. And in fact, I spent my chocolate and my cigarettes and my coffee to get the mathematics lessons. We were disappointed in the world. We thought that after the Holocaust, which is a word that came out after the Nuremberg process, we thought that the world would stop doing that. But it didn't appear to. They didn't even care for us, the survivors, very much. 150,000 Jews were sitting in Germany in camps with no place to go. No country wanted us. Only when Israel was established in 1948 did all those people got up and go to Israel. They got up and they went to Israel. That was a saving grace of Israel's establishment for us. But we left early. We went to Norway. And the Norwegians were very kind to us. In contrast to what we felt about the world in general, we felt very welcomed in Norway. So, in general, it was a disappointment with the world for not understanding the terrible trauma that we went through. In fact, it's interesting that no one came to ask us, how do you feel? They supplied us with food and water and the necessities of life. But no one asked us, how do you feel? I was full of hate. Nobody tried to help me. I had to cure myself. So the world was a disappointment to us after the war.
How soon after the war, after liberation, did you start to understand the extent of the devastation to the European Jews?
After we were liberated, everyone started to look for family. Polish Jews tried to go back to Poland when they could. Later, not at first, but later it was possible to get out. We did not want to go to Lithuania. We knew that our people are dead. 3/4 of the Lithuanian Jews were killed in the first 5 months of the war, before Auschwitz, before anything. We discovered the total devastation of the Jewish world. It became clear to most of my friends that they have nobody in the world. I was shy telling my neighbors in the hospital that my parents survived, because nobody had such luck. Very few. I only knew one boy who found both his father and mother, besides myself. So it became very clear that we are the remainders of Jewry of Europe. It became obvious because nobody had family that survived. And that came as a very big shock and a pain to all of us.
When you arrived in Africa, you talk in your memoir about trying to tell people about your experiences during the war. And it became clear that people simply didn't want to hear.
When we came to Africa, we found relatives. My father's large family was there in Johannesburg. And my father was very anxious to tell them what happened to us. My father was talking about it all the time. And I noticed that our relatives asked him, "Judel, don't talk about it. Julius, it's too painful for you. Don't talk about it." I didn't think it was painful to him. It was painful to them to hear it. So I shut up completely. I stopped talking about what happened to me, but my father kept trying. He collected a huge library again about the Second War and the Holocaust, about the Second World War. And he was always trying to understand how is it possible that in the middle of Europe we would have such murder, such viciousness. I don't think he ever got a clear answer, but I didn't talk about it. I went through university without ever telling my fellow students where I was. But the professor once grabbed me, Professor Bozzoli, and he said, "Gotz, where are you from? What's your history?" So I told him. And he was shaking his head with amazement. He was also not born in South Africa. He was born in Italy. He was a very kind and wonderful professor and a good man. So I told him, but I never told anybody else. So most of my friends in Africa didn't know my history. I kept quiet. It was not relevant. It was too painful for them to hear it. After 25 years, I can start talking. Now it's history. Students listen to it. Now people are prepared to hear it.
But it took 25 years.
Yes, it took 25 years.
How did you feel about Africa's Rhodesia and South Africa contributed so much to your life?
In Africa, I discovered a big problem. I loved Africa. I loved the countryside, I loved the animals, I loved the bush, I loved to climb the mountains. But I hated their politics. I fell into a white society that treated black people abominably. And I couldn't accept it. After Dachau, after all that, what I've been through, it was total anathema to me. But I had to adapt. And I had to be careful. Because sometimes I voiced my opinion, and I got pulled in. I was working in summers. I worked as a radio mechanic at a shop to earn some money. And I once talked to one of the black workers in our place about a political issue of the day. And another worker, a Rhodesian guy, reported me to the boss. Eli talks politics to the blacks. The boss called me in. "Eli, what are you doing? What are you talking about?" I said, "Nothing, I don't know. I was just talking. We were having an election and I said that I preferred one man to another because it would be better for the black people." He says, "Don't do it. Stop talking politics. You are coming from the wrong angle. You are not a local, you are an outsider." The boss happened to be a Jewish man, And he was kind to me because he could have thrown me out, because that is what the Rhodesian co-worker wanted. He wanted him to fire me. He said, "Don't talk, Ellie. Just do your work." So I learned my lesson, to be careful, not to say. But I knew I would not live there the rest of my life. Sooner or later, I'll have to get out of that society. And when I married a woman from South Africa, from Johannesburg, and we talked, and she agreed. She also didn't like it, even though she was born there, although it was much more common understanding for her. I said, we must get out of here. We took 3 children out of Africa. I didn't want the kids to grow up racists. I wanted them to live in a civilized country. I mean, they were civilized, but they were not. It was a terrible society. Apartheid, South Africa, the treatment of the races, not acceptable. I came to Canada. Oh, wonderful country, Canada. 1964 we came here. It's a free country.
When you arrived, did you know you were home, for lack of a better word?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
In 1964, when you arrived in Canada, did you feel like you were in the place you wanted to be?
When we came to Canada because we chose it. We chose Canada as a place to settle. We knew what Canada is, more or less. We read books, we studied up, and we found that Toronto was a center of industry, so we focused on Toronto. We loved it. I was so happy here. It was wonderful. I know Canada also had a history of prejudice against Jews, against other people. It was a pretty closed-up society before. But by the time we came in '64, it was getting better and better. And now I'm very happy to be here. It's wonderful. We are doing a great job in Canada. Besides, I saw in South Africa a little film about the Algonquin Park, a canoe going down the water, and a moose was standing there. And I thought, that's a country I want to go to, because I loved it. We went camping all the time in in Canada, with the children.
Amazing. Although I read about the crocodile hunting. The moose are okay though, right?
Yeah. I wouldn't shoot a moose, no way. I didn't shoot a deer. I learned how to hunt. It came about for the following reason. I went to school for 9 months in Rhodesia, and they had cadets. And an officer came and took out all the boys to march us through the street, waving our arms. I was embarrassed. Waving my arms like a wild man, I was hoping nobody would see me. I didn't like militarism. But then they put us to the shooting range, and they gave me a big military rifle to aim at something. And I didn't know how to use a rifle. So I had to tell the officer, I don't know how to use that. You see, every Rhodesian kid had a rifle. They knew how to do it. So he lay down next to me and he showed me how a rifle works. And I started to fire, and I was quite good. I was getting a good aim. So I was pleased that finally I have a rifle that's not pointed at me. And then I bought a rifle, a hunting rifle, and a revolver. And I learned a little bit how to hunt. And I had a friend who was an old Rhodesian guy, and he went hunting crocodiles, and he took me with, and I learned how to do it. We shot crocodiles, we shot wild ducks to eat. They are not very good, they are tough as nails. And I climbed mountains, I started to ride horses, I learned how to jump horses a little bit. I loved life. I was full of experience going out in the bush. But a gazelle I couldn't shoot. It was too beautiful. I didn't want to. A crocodile was okay. Fishing is okay.
Fair enough. So you were part of building a very successful company in South Africa. You've had great success in every way in Canada, had a beautiful family, why did you start to so actively talk about your personal history? Was there a turning point?
Life in Africa wasn't easy. We came as refugees. My parents had to learn English. I learned it quite quickly. It took them a bit longer. They were not making an easy living when I went to university. So when I came back to Rhodesia after university, I couldn't get a job as an engineer. There was no industry there. There was agricultural land mostly. So I had to start something on my own. So I started a workshop for radio repairs because I couldn't get a job. And then it became bigger, so we opened a bigger store and we were selling bicycles and radios. And I started something else because retail didn't please me. It's too passive. So I started a sound recording studio. And later I started an advertising agency. And after that I needed films for the advertising company, so I started to make films. And then I got married and I moved to Johannesburg, and the family, my wife's family, took me in. They had started a factory for plastics, and it was electronic welding of plastics, which was my specialty, so to speak. So I learned how to work in a factory, and we were successful. And then I started to campaign that we must get out of Africa. And we took out the whole family to Canada. So in Canada, we started the same kind of a factory. And we became successful. After a number of years, we had to learn how to sell in Canada. It wasn't easy the first 7 years, but eventually after 7 years, we were well established. And that is when I fulfilled my dream and I started to fly. I learned to fly, I bought my own aeroplane, I became an instrument pilot, I flew the family to Florida and to Nova Scotia, I flew to New York, Chicago, all the time. We established a second factory in Chicago, and it was a good life. And now the children left home and the dog died, we are free.
And again, why did it become important to start to talk about your experiences during the war?
After 25, 30 years, it became an issue. In Toronto, when we arrived here, soon after, was a time with Zundel, the Zundel trial, when the Holocaust denier, a German national who lived in Canada, or maybe he was a Canadian citizen, Zundel, started to campaign that the Holocaust is a lie and it never happened, and this aroused us all. All the survivors here gathered together, and they started to object to what is going on. We went to the courtroom, we packed the benches there, and at the Holocaust Center in Toronto, we started to say that we have to do something about it. And we started to plan to go out to schools and to talk, to tell them the truth, what happened, and that they shouldn't listen to the Holocaust deniers. So in a way, that is what emboldened us to go out and start telling our story.
And what was it like when you started to tell your story? How did the students hear the story? How did you learn to communicate effectively your story to school groups across the country?
We started to go out and talk to kids who had no idea at all what we were talking about. Because in Canada, in the schools, they were not teaching the Holocaust. It was part of European history, and there was one sentence in the book about it, or two, in the school books. So we had to broaden it, so we had to start telling our story. And it took a while to learn what is important, how do you tell the story. We started to teach ourselves how to tell our story. In fact, I used to, on a number of occasions, because I was a more experienced public speaker, I started to teach my other friends, the survivors, how to tell their story effectively. It doesn't matter what your city was called, it doesn't matter, you've got to tell the essence of the story. So we became better at it by practicing. And we filmed each other and we tried to watch ourselves doing it to learn how to do it well. I had some experience speaking in particular the United States about my products as an engineer. So I used the technique that I've learned to talk to schools. And we established eventually a Holocaust Center in Toronto. And then we had a theater there where we could invite schools to come. So now we had to make rosters. Everybody had to come and speak sometime. So we had to give our time. And it was difficult because we were working and living and running businesses or working at jobs. So we took a lot of us to fill the roster to receive schools. That was the beginning of teaching history. Later we learned how to run a PowerPoint program, how to show pictures and slides. Initially we were just talking.
How does it feel to, you're publishing your memoir?
I was asked many times, are you writing a book? And I said, no, I'm not a writer. I somehow felt that memoir writing is difficult for me. But eventually I was persuaded and I started to write. I'm not a very good writer. I write more about the facts and less about my feelings, like an engineering report. But I've done my best. I tried to write and tell the story because so many people asked me. And I'm very excited now what will come out. And I'm sure I'll find it unsatisfactory when I read it, but that's the best I can do.
What do you hope when students read your book, when family members, future generations read your book? What do you hope someone takes away from the story of your life?
There are some lessons in my talk for students. First of all, I want them to understand that prejudice and hate are very negative activities for a human being. I want them to understand how is it possible that in the center of Europe, in the center of our civilization, we killed 6 million Jews and 6 million others, Poles, Czechs, Russians, prisoners of war, all kinds of killings, not in a war setting. I want the people to learn something. And I have a theory that to have genocide, you need three things. And that is what I try to convey to students. You need personal prejudice against a minority. Human beings have a problem. Anybody who looks different to themselves, they are not happy with them. And I urge my students, I'm not saying you have to love them. Be curious about them. Find out who they are. We are bringing in a lot of people into Canada now. People, refugees, people who have come from some terrible places of war, immigrants. And they are not like us. They are different. So I urge my students, first of all, become familiar with them and you'll discover your common humanity. But genocide requires more than just personal prejudice in a society. It requires a government that supports murder. In Rwanda, they distributed machetes and they killed 1 million people with knives. In Germany, they distributed machine guns. The result is the same. And we need a third element. We need a leader a politician who stands up and tells you it's okay to kill. Hitler was an amazing speaker. He convinced the whole nation that they were superior to everybody else and that they could take other people's land and they had a right to do it. So I urge my students to make sure that they vote, because in Canada, young people don't vote. Up to the age of 30, they don't bother. Don't they care what kind of country you'll have, what kind of government you'll have? You must vote, and you must make sure that you are not poisoned by hatred. Hatred can be taught. When a politician stands up in a difficult time in Canada, economically, and he says, the reason we have problems here is because of them, the newcomers, the immigrants, don't listen. Don't be fascinated by a very good speaker because he can hypnotize you. Listen to others. Don't accept that one person has all the answers to all the problems. Listen to others. That is my message. And about hate. That hate is a total waste of time because you are thinking about them, the people who hurt you. I'm not denying that people have hurt you. But you don't have to forgive them. You don't have to hate them. Forgiveness is a separate issue. Forgiveness is almost a religious issue. Because nobody asked me for forgiveness. Why should I forgive them? I don't forgive the people who have done terrible things to me. I just don't spend time hating them because it takes me away from living. That's the message I want students to get from me, from my talks. That is why I speak to thousands of students every year. Now that I'm retired, I can do it.
Amazing. I have one last question, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll see where we're at. My one last question is this. You went skydiving at 89. How could you do that to your amazing wife?
I went skydiving at 89 because Canada turned 150 years old. So I wanted to do something special about Canada. The CBC said, what are you doing special to commemorate the holiday? And I thought, I'll fulfill a dream I've had for a long time. I wanted to jump from an aeroplane. Now, I used to fly an aeroplane, fly gliders, everything, but I never jumped. The old parachutes were a bit dangerous. They used to come down very hard. But now, the parachutes are different. You can glide out. You can land very softly on your bum. And because I had an instructor behind me, it's his bum, not mine. So I felt good. I thought, this is a time. And I'll tell you, jumping out of the plane, that moment, your heart stops, but then it resumes, thank God. And you glide down beautifully. You fall like a rock. I thought I'll fly like a bird. Nah, you fall like a rock. But it was fun. And when they asked my wife, the CBC asked my wife, Mrs. Gotts, what do you think about him jumping? Oh, she says, I wasn't worried he would die young.
That's a great, the other great line is from your mother when you said, I'd like to learn how to, was it learn how to fly?
Oh, my mother hated my aeroplane. She absolutely was furious that I tried to learn to fly in Rhodesia. And actually I went flying secretly, I didn't tell her. Because when she found my application for a medical for flying on my desk, she made a big noise. If you go flying, I'm dying. It's ridiculous to go flying after you survive Dachau. What's the matter with you? And when I had children, oh, she had something to say about that, I can tell you. Thank God my wife was good enough and self-assured enough to let me do what I wanted.
Amazing. Good?
Great.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you need some, Tim?
I'm good.
Yes, yeah, no slides, no,
Maybe a few,
A
but I
few?
feel like maybe
yeah?
a few, but.
Yeah, have a sip of water. Can we take 5 minutes and then
Sure.
and then do one last thing?
Do you want to
Okay.
see the pictures? Okay, are you rolling?
Yeah, I am rolling. So let me just.
So here's my mother and I
We're gonna need quiet.
when I was 9 years old.
Just one
What?
second. 1 second.
Sorry.
Okay, and great.
Okay.
Go ahead.
This is my mother and I when I was 9 years old, photographed by my father. Here I'm 13 years old with a black uniform, which I was so proud of. I'm going to high school. I never got to wear it. The war started. Leave that out.
Okay.
I don't want to stress too much the Lithuanian participation in the Holocaust. This is a picture of the ghetto gate when people had to come from the age of 15 to 65, women to 55 to come and work, slave labor. They picked up groups of people under guard, soldiers, marched them off to their working place. You can see the wooden houses in the background. This is our friend Helmut Raucher, the guy who sorted us, the guy who ran the Great Aktion, and the man who shot personally in the back of the neck my best friend Itamar Shapiro, his father Professor Shapiro, his mother and his grandmother. Somebody inquired from England where they were. Helmut Raucher drove into the ghetto, picked up the family, took them to the 9th Fort and killed them all in front of witnesses. This is a document, the Jaeger report. I show it to students because I want them to believe that what I'm telling them is true, because we have German documents confirming the Holocaust, so they shouldn't believe the Holocaust deniers. I like to show them this picture of a Holocaust denier right here in Canada. Monica Schaefer says the Holocaust, you can read it there, the Holocaust is the biggest pernicious lie in history. She knows better. She is a Holocaust denier. This is a picture I discovered in the Holocaust Museum in Washington of a student of mine whom I recognized as soon as I saw the picture, working on the lathe. I told my wife, I don't think he survived the war. He was younger than I was. And then came a picture of me. I found my own picture of the war, the only picture I have of the war, of myself, teaching other kids in the school in the ghetto. I'm the guy in the middle with the black hair, make no mistake. I discovered when my picture and the story was published in the Star newspaper, as a person from Israel was in Toronto on that day. He took the newspaper article to people that he knew had been in Kovno Ghetto, Kaunas Ghetto. And one guy recognized me on the picture, the one standing on my left hand in the other picture. So now I came to Israel to meet him, and we had lunch together. He's sitting next to me, and he thanked me for having trained him well. He now has a factory building machines which he exports all over the world. And he brought 2 other guys who were also my students. That was a very emotional meeting.
So we'll just pick, let's say, 3 more. Are there 3 that should we just keep?
All right, go through. Next. Yes, this is my little girl, my cousin, Dalia, with her adoptive mother and the mother of that woman. And those 2 brave women who risked their life saved her life. Next. 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 This was a camp where we arrived. Dachau, camp number 1. The houses half buried in the ground, 2 rows of barbed wire, machine gun posts. Our site for 10 months. This is the inside of a barrack. I spent in that kind of barrack 25 men sleeping on one side on the hard boards and 25 on the other. I spent 10 months in that barrack. I had my 17th birthday there. A time of starvation and 12-hour shift labor. A time of not washing because we had no washing facilities, so we were full of lice. It was a place where I carried out many dead friends to be buried in a mass grave. Out of 3,000 men in this camp, 870 are buried in one mass grave. And I helped to carry many of them there. Next. Here is Monika Schäfer again. She describes, this I have to read you. She says that of course people were held against their will during the war. But she says they were looked after, they were workers, and they were looked after in the best way possible under the war. She knows better what happened in Dachau than I do. I'll tell you, that woman, just 2 months ago, went to Germany and repeated the same thing. In Canada, she can say what she likes. But in Germany, she is now in jail, because in Germany you are not allowed to say that the Holocaust is a lie. So she is now in jail for education, I understand. I hope she learns something. Next.
Do you have one where your family image?
No. My wife, yes, my wife and I.
Yes. Do you,
And
can we,
I have the gentleman. Oh, that's my cousin.
oh, it's your.
This is
oh,
my
the-
brother.
oh, there we
I
go.
have to switch cards.
Oh, do it.